Would you give away the one thing keeping your life together? One man did, and years later, what he got in return was beyond anything he could have imagined. Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and a warm welcome to everyone. Daniel gripped the steering wheel of his aging sedan, the vibrations from the uneven highway humming through his fingers as the car struggled to maintain its pace. The night stretched endlessly before him, the inky darkness broken only by the faint glimmers of stars overhead and the occasional flash of passing headlights. It had been a brutal day, one that felt like the culmination of a string of defeats that had plagued him over the past year. That morning, his boss had summoned him into the office, his expression apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Daniel," the man had said, his words a hammer blow to Daniel's already fragile state. "We've had to make some cuts. You've been a valuable part of the team, but," the words blurred together after that. Daniel had nodded numbly, clutching the termination letter in one hand and the remains of his pride in the other. He hadn't even argued, there was nothing left to fight for. The job had been his lifeline, the only thing keeping him afloat after the series of losses he'd endured. His parents had passed away within months of each other the previous year, leaving him to shoulder the grief and the financial burden of their hospital bills. The job was supposed to be his fresh start, his chance to rebuild, but now that chance had been snatched away too. The car rattled as he hit a pothole, jerking him back to the present. His headlights illuminated the narrow stretch of highway ahead, lined with skeletal trees that swayed in the cold winter wind. The heater in the car had given out months ago, and the chill seeped through the thin fabric of his coat, making him shiver. He had no destination in mind, just an urge to keep driving, to escape the suffocating thoughts that crowded his mind. But then, in the distance, he saw it, a pair of hazard lights flashing rhythmically like a desperate plea for attention. As he drew closer, the scene came into focus, a car parked awkwardly on the shoulder of the road, its hood propped open. Next to it stood a man, waving a flashlight in frantic arcs, his breath visible in the freezing air. Beside him was a woman, clutching a small child wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The child's face was pale, their cheeks red from the cold, and they shivered visibly, their small body pressed tightly against the woman's for warmth. Daniel's first instinct was to keep driving. He had enough problems of his own, stopping would only add to his burden. But something about the scene tugged at him, a memory, perhaps, of a time when he had been the one in need, when he had wished desperately for someone, anyone, to help. He slowed the car, the engine protesting with a sputter as he pulled to the side of the road and rolled down the window. The man approached quickly, his face a mix of relief and anxiety. "Thank you for stopping," he said, his voice hoarse. "Our car broke down, and we're trying to get to my brother's house. We don't have any money for a tow, and the nearest town is miles away." His words tumbled out in a rush, his desperation palpable. The woman joined him, her eyes filled with worry as she glanced between Daniel and the child in her arms. "Please," she said softly. "We just need to get to my brother's. He'll help us once we get there." Daniel looked at the child, their tiny face pressed against the woman's shoulder, and felt his resolve weakening. He asked the man what had happened, and the story spilled out, a tale of eviction, job loss, and a string of misfortunes that had left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hope that family could provide a safe haven. The man's voice cracked as he spoke, and Daniel felt the weight of their despair pressing down on him. He glanced at his own car, its paint peeling and engine barely hanging on, and thought about how it was his only remaining possession of value. He'd bought it used years ago, back when things were better, and it had been his lifeline ever since. But now, as he looked at the family shivering in the cold, he realized that his problems, as heavy as they felt, paled in comparison to theirs. He hesitated, the decision tearing at him. Logic screamed at him to leave, to wish them well and move on. But something deeper, something unshakable, urged him to act. "Take my car," he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. The man stared at him, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. "What?" he asked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. You can't be serious. Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. I am. You need it more than I do. The woman gasped, tears welling in her eyes, and the man shook his head, protesting. We can't accept that. It's too much. But Daniel insisted, handing over the keys and explaining how to start the car, warning them about its quirks. It's not much, he said, but it'll get you where you need to go. The family's gratitude was overwhelming. The man hugged him tightly, promising to repay him one day, and the woman thanked him through her tears. Even the child, though too young to fully understand the sacrifice, smiled shyly at him from the back seat as they prepared to leave. Daniel watched as they drove off, the taillights fading into the distance, leaving him standing alone on the side of the road. The cold wind bit at his face, and he shivered, wrapping his arms around himself as he began the long walk home. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, a belief that maybe, just maybe, his act of kindness would lead to something greater. As the night deepened, he couldn't shake the question echoing in his mind, had he just made the biggest mistake of his life, or would this moment define something extraordinary? Daniel, a man in his late 30s, lived in the quiet corner of a city that never seemed to notice him. His life, once filled with ambitions and dreams, had become a monotonous routine, defined by struggle and survival. A former marketing professional, Daniel had lost his job at a mid-sized firm during a company downsizing 3 years ago, a blow that triggered a downward spiral he hadn't managed to escape from. Since then, his days were filled with the drudgery of odd jobs that barely paid enough to keep the lights on in his modest apartment, a small space that felt more like a holding cell than a home. The walls, adorned with peeling paint and outdated fixtures, mirrored the stagnation of his life, each crack and stain a reminder of opportunities missed and potential wasted. His mornings began with the same dull ache in his chest, a combination of exhaustion and the weight of knowing he was treading water in a sea of uncertainty. The only respite from this grind was his evening drives, a solitary ritual where he'd escape the confines of his apartment, climbing into his battered old sedan to roam aimlessly through the city streets. The car, a 1998 model with a rusting frame and an engine that groaned with age, was more than just a vehicle to him. It was a relic of better days, a time when he had a steady paycheck, a fiancée he thought would share his future, and the belief that life was full of promise. But those days were long gone, and now the car served as both his refuge and his reminder of all he had lost. Daniel's emotional struggles were not limited to his financial woes. His personal life was a series of fractured connections and unspoken regrets. After losing his job, his fiancée, Maria, had grown distant, her patience with his inability to get back on his feet wearing thin until, one day, she left without looking back. I can't keep waiting for you to figure things out, Daniel, she had said, her voice heavy with frustration and sorrow. Her departure left a void that no amount of self-recrimination could fill, and Daniel withdrew further into himself, unable to face the judgment he imagined in the eyes of others. Friends who once celebrated his successes drifted away, their lives moving forward while his stood still. His family, small and scattered, had their own battles to fight, and Daniel, unwilling to burden them with his failures, rarely reached out. Loneliness became his constant companion, a silent presence that followed him through his days and whispered doubts into his ears at night. Despite the bleakness of his circumstances, Daniel was not entirely defeated. Somewhere deep within him, a flicker of resilience remained, though it often felt like an ember struggling against the wind. He was a kind-hearted man, his empathy forged by his own hardships. He understood what it meant to be invisible, to feel like the world had moved on without you, and it made him acutely aware of the struggles of others. He often went out of his way to help in small ways, paying for a stranger's coffee when he could spare the change or offering a listening ear to the elderly woman who lived in his building and rarely had visitors. These acts of kindness, though minor, gave him a sense of purpose, a reminder that he could still make a difference, no matter how small. Daniel's car, for all its flaws, was central to his identity. It was the one thing he had managed to hold on to through the years, a symbol of his independence and a link to the man he used to be. He spent hours tinkering with it, not because he was a mechanic but because it gave him something to focus on, a way to quiet the noise in his mind. The vehicle had its quirks, an unreliable heater, a radio that only picked up static, and a tendency to stall at inconvenient moments, but Daniel loved it nonetheless. It was his sanctuary, the place where he could drive through the city and imagine, if only for a moment, that he was still in control of his life. Yet, even as he clung to it, he knew that the car, like his life, was falling apart. The repairs it needed were beyond his means, and each new rattle or groan from the engine felt like a countdown to the day when it would give out entirely. On this particular night, Daniel's thoughts were darker than usual. He had spent the day unsuccessfully applying for jobs, his inbox filled with automated rejection emails and the occasional silence that was worse than a no. His savings, already depleted, were almost gone, and he wasn't sure how he'd make next month's rent. As he drove aimlessly through the city, the weight of his situation pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the worn leather, as if holding on to it could somehow anchor him against the storm of his thoughts. The streets were mostly empty, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt. The hum of the car's engine was the only sound, a low, steady rhythm that seemed to echo the uncertainty in his heart. Daniel often wondered how his life had come to this. He replayed the choices he had made, the moments where he could have done something differently, and the twists of fate that were beyond his control. He thought about the man he used to be, confident, optimistic, and full of plans for the future, and compared him to the man he saw in the rearview mirror, tired, weathered, and lost. The reflection stared back at him, its eyes shadowed by fatigue and framed by lines that seemed deeper than his years. He barely recognized himself anymore, and that realization was perhaps the hardest to bear. But even in his darkest moments, Daniel couldn't ignore the faint glimmer of hope that refused to die. It was there, buried beneath the weight of his despair, a quiet voice that urged him to keep going, to believe that better days were possible. It was this hope, fragile though it was, that kept him moving forward, one step at a time. He didn't know what the future held or if he would ever find his way out of the darkness, but he clung to the belief that his story wasn't over yet. And as the night stretched on, Daniel had no way of knowing that a single, seemingly insignificant decision was about to change everything, setting him on a path he never could have imagined. Daniel's life had become a monotonous cycle of survival, each day bleeding into the next with the same gray hopelessness. On a particularly cold winter night, he found himself driving aimlessly through the quiet streets, his old car rattling over every bump in the road. He didn't know where he was going, nor did it matter, driving was his only escape from the suffocating walls of his small, dimly lit apartment. The car heater had long stopped working, and the chill seeped into his bones, but Daniel hardly noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the weight of overdue bills, rejection letters, and the relentless fear of what tomorrow might bring. As he drove along a deserted stretch of highway, the headlights of his car illuminated a strange sight in the distance, a pair of hazard lights blinking in the darkness. He squinted, his curiosity piqued despite himself, and as he approached, he saw a car pulled over on the shoulder, its hood open and steam billowing out into the frosty air. Beside the car stood a man waving desperately, a flashlight in one hand, his breath visible in the cold night. Next to him was a woman, cradling a small child wrapped in a thin blanket, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. The sight struck a chord deep within Daniel, stirring memories of his own struggles, of the countless nights he had felt alone and helpless. For a moment, he debated whether to stop. After all, what could he possibly offer when he had so little himself? But something about the child's small frame shivering in the cold and the silent plea in the woman's eyes made him pull over, the decision feeling almost instinctual. Daniel rolled down his window, and the man rushed forward, his voice trembling as he explained their predicament. They had been driving for hours after being evicted from their apartment, heading to a relative's house in a nearby town when their car broke down. "We don't have the money for a tow or repairs," the man admitted, his voice cracking with shame. The woman stepped closer, clutching the child tightly as she added, "We just need to get to my brother's place." He'll help us once we get there. Her words hung in the air, a fragile plea that carried the weight of desperation and exhaustion. Daniel looked at the family, his heart twisting as he saw the fear in the man's eyes, the weariness in the woman's posture, and the small child's face pressed against her shoulder, their cheeks red from the cold. He thought of his own empty apartment, the small comforts he still had, and the car that, despite its faults, had been his lifeline. He couldn't explain what compelled him, but in that moment, he knew what he had to do. "Take my car," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with emotion. The words seemed to hang in the air, almost surreal, and for a moment, the man stared at him, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. "Are you serious?" the man asked, his disbelief evident. Daniel nodded, forcing a small smile as he added, "It's old, but it'll get you where you need to go." The family's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The woman began to cry, her tears streaming silently as she clutched the child even tighter. The man shook his head, his voice trembling as he said, "We can't take your car. That's too much." But Daniel insisted, his resolve unwavering. "You need it more than I do," he said simply. "I'll figure something out." He handed over the keys, explaining the car's quirks and apologizing for its condition. The man tried to protest again, promising to repay him someday, but Daniel waved it off, his focus on the child who had turned to look at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Take care of them," Daniel said softly, his words directed at the man but meant for the entire family. As the man thanked him profusely, his gratitude spilling out in a rush of words, Daniel stepped back and watched as they climbed into the car. The child waved at him shyly from the back seat, a small, hesitant gesture that filled Daniel's chest with an inexplicable warmth. He stood on the side of the road, the cold wind biting at his skin, as the car's taillights disappeared into the distance. For a moment, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that he had done the right thing. But as the reality of his situation set in, the doubts began to creep in. What would he do now, without a car, without a way to get to his odd jobs or escape the confines of his apartment? Had he just made the biggest mistake of his life, or would this single act of kindness lead to something he couldn't yet foresee? Daniel began the long walk back to the city, his mind racing with questions and his heart heavy with both fear and hope, unaware that this seemingly small moment would ripple through his life in ways he could never have imagined. Daniel had always lived a solitary life, but his quiet acts of kindness had a way of weaving invisible threads between him and those around him, creating bonds he never fully realized. In his run-down apartment complex, there was Mrs. Cooper, an elderly widow who lived on the first floor and struggled to carry her groceries up the steep stairs. Daniel would always stop to help her, carefully balancing the paper bags in his arms as she chattered away about her late husband and her children who lived too far away to visit. She often thanked him by offering him a cup of tea, which he would accept, sitting at her small, cluttered table while she reminisced about her younger days. Mrs. Cooper's stories, though repetitive, were a source of comfort for Daniel, a reminder that even in the simplest moments, there could be meaning. Then there was Jamal, the teenage boy who lived next door, whose father worked long hours and rarely had time for him. Jamal, with his shy smile and oversized headphones, would knock on Daniel's door whenever he needed help with his homework, especially math, which Daniel had always been good at. They'd sit together at the small table in Daniel's apartment, the boy's hesitant questions slowly giving way to a quiet confidence as Daniel patiently explained each problem. In those moments, Daniel saw a reflection of himself as a boy, struggling to find his place in the world, and he felt a quiet sense of purpose in guiding Jamal even in small ways. At the local diner where Daniel worked part-time washing dishes, there was a waitress named Claire, whose cheerful demeanor masked the struggles of being a single mother. She often worked double shifts to make ends meet, and during their short breaks, she and Daniel would sit together in the tiny staff room, sharing stories about their lives. Claire had a way of making even the bleakest situations seem bearable, her laughter ringing out like a bell in the dreary confines of the diner. "You're a good listener, Daniel," she'd say, nudging his arm playfully. "I bet you were the guy everyone went to for advice back in the day." Daniel would smile faintly, unsure how to respond, but he appreciated her company nonetheless. One evening, when Claire's babysitter cancelled, she brought her young daughter, Lily, to the diner, settling her in a corner booth with coloring books and crayons. During a rare lull in the evening rush, Daniel approached the booth and sat across from Lily, who eyed him curiously before shyly showing him her drawing of a cat. "That's the most artistic cat I've ever seen," Daniel said, his voice warm. Lily giggled, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt a flicker of joy, as if he were part of something bigger than himself. Despite these connections, Daniel's loneliness lingered, a quiet ache that he carried with him like a shadow. But the bonds he formed, no matter how small, gave him a sense of belonging in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. Even with strangers, Daniel's kindness left an impact. Like the time he noticed a homeless man sitting on a park bench, his face weathered and his clothes threadbare. Daniel, who had just bought a sandwich for himself, hesitated for a moment before walking over and handing it to the man without a word. The man looked up, his eyes wide with gratitude, and muttered a heartfelt "thank you." It wasn't much, but it was all Daniel could give, and the man's reaction stayed with him long after. These moments, though fleeting, reminded Daniel that he still had the power to make a difference, even if his own life felt stagnant. The emotional connections Daniel built were subtle but profound, shaping him in ways he didn't fully understand. He often thought about the people in his life, their struggles and triumphs, and how their paths intertwined with his own. It was these relationships, however small, that kept him grounded, giving him a sense of purpose in a world that often seemed overwhelming. He didn't realize it at the time, but the seeds of compassion he planted in the lives of others would one day grow into something extraordinary, changing his life in ways he could never have imagined. And as he continued to navigate the challenges of his own existence, those bonds remained a quiet source of strength, reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was still light to be found in the connections we share with others. Daniel's decision to give away his car, while seemingly noble, plunged him into a cascade of challenges he hadn't anticipated. The walk back home that freezing winter night was only the beginning. The biting cold seeped into his bones, and his shoes, worn thin from years of use, did little to protect him from the icy pavement. By the time he reached his apartment, his legs ached, his hands were numb, and his mind was swirling with doubts. The reality of what he had done began to sink in as he stared at the empty parking spot outside his building, the space where his old sedan had faithfully rested for years. That car had been his lifeline, his one semblance of stability in a world that seemed to offer him nothing but setbacks, and now it was gone. His neighbors, noticing his unusual arrival on foot, asked what had happened, and though Daniel tried to explain his decision, their reactions ranged from disbelief to outright criticism. "You gave away your car?" Mrs. Cooper exclaimed, her brow furrowed in concern. "Daniel, that's the only thing you had left. How are you going to get around now?" Jamal, the teenage boy next door, looked at him with wide eyes, struggling to comprehend why anyone would make such a sacrifice. Even Claire, his co-worker at the diner, shook her head in disbelief when he recounted the story during a shift, her voice tinged with frustration as she said, "Daniel, you can't save everyone. What about yourself?" Without the car, Daniel's already precarious life became even harder to navigate. His part-time job at the diner, located miles away, now required him to rely on public transportation, a system that was notoriously unreliable in his town. Buses were often late, and routes were limited, forcing him to wake up hours earlier just to make it to his shifts on time. On several occasions, he found himself sprinting to catch the last bus home late at night, his breath visible in the cold air, only to miss it by mere seconds and be left stranded. The long walks that followed were grueling, the empty streets stretching endlessly under the dim glow of streetlights. His exhaustion mounted with each passing day, his body worn down by the physical toll and his mind plagued by the gnawing question, had he made the right choice? Financially, the loss of his car also hit him hard. Odd jobs he had relied on to supplement his income, such as helping with deliveries or running errands for neighbors, were no longer feasible without a vehicle. His already meager savings dwindled rapidly, and he found himself cutting corners wherever he could, skipping meals, wearing the same clothes until they were threadbare, and keeping the heat in his apartment at the lowest setting to save on utility bills. The weight of his struggles began to erode Daniel's spirit, and he found himself retreating further into isolation. His neighbors, once sympathetic, grew tired of his constant hardships, their initial support giving way to quiet judgment. Mrs. Cooper, though still friendly, started avoiding lengthy conversations, her concern for Daniel tempered by her own limited resources. Jamal, sensing the tension, stopped coming by for homework help, his shy knock on Daniel's door replaced by an awkward silence whenever they passed each other in the hallway. Even Claire, who had always been a source of encouragement, seemed distant, her laughter less frequent and her words more guarded. Daniel couldn't blame them, he had become a burden, a reminder of the fragility of their own lives. The emotional toll of these fractured connections weighed heavily on him, amplifying the loneliness that had always lingered in the background. But the most painful obstacle came from within. Doubt, once a quiet whisper, grew into a deafening roar in Daniel's mind. He replayed the moment he handed over his car to the struggling family, questioning whether his decision had been driven by genuine compassion or a desperate need to feel useful in a life that had lost its purpose. He thought about the family, where they were now, whether they had made it safely to their destination, and whether they even remembered his sacrifice. The uncertainty gnawed at him, filling him with a sense of futility that he couldn't shake. His act of kindness, once a source of pride, now felt like a mistake, a reckless gamble that had left him with nothing but regret. Late at night, as he lay awake in his cold apartment, Daniel's thoughts would spiral into a dark place, his mind replaying every failure and every moment of loss that had brought him to this point. He wondered if he had any strength left to keep going or if he had finally reached the end of his resilience. As weeks turned into months, Daniel faced resistance not only from the world around him but also from the part of himself that longed to give up. Each day felt like a battle, a relentless fight against the odds that seemed stacked against him. Yet, despite the overwhelming challenges, a small part of him refused to let go of the hope that had driven him to act in the first place. It was this hope, fragile and flickering, that kept him moving forward, even when the weight of his struggles threatened to crush him completely. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the very decision that had brought him so much hardship would soon lead to a turning point that would change his life forever, in ways he could never have imagined. Months had passed since Daniel had given away his car to the struggling family, and life had not been kind to him since. The grueling walks to work, the judgmental stares of neighbors, and the endless nights spent questioning his choices had worn him down to the brink of despair. He often found himself standing at the window of his tiny apartment, staring out at the empty parking spot below, wondering if his sacrifice had been worth it. One particularly bleak evening, as a cold rain poured relentlessly against the glass, Daniel sat on his worn-out couch with his head in his hands, a stack of unpaid bills on the table before him. He had hit rock bottom, or so he thought, until a sudden knock at the door startled him. Confused and hesitant, he dragged himself to the door, expecting yet another landlord complaint or a nosy neighbor. Instead, he found a man in a sharp suit holding a large envelope, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Daniels?" the man asked. Daniel nodded cautiously, his heart pounding as the man handed him the envelope. "This is for you," he said simply before turning and disappearing into the rain. Daniel stared at the envelope for a long moment, the rain-soaked paper cold in his trembling hands, before slowly tearing it open. Inside was a neatly folded letter and a set of documents that made his breath catch in his throat. The letter was from the family to whom he had given his car, written in the same shaky handwriting he remembered from the note they had left on his dashboard that fateful night. The words blurred as Daniel's eyes filled with tears, but he forced himself to read. They explained how his act of kindness had saved their lives, how they had been able to reach safety and rebuild after their tragedy, and how his selflessness had inspired them to keep going even when things seemed hopeless. They spoke of their gratitude, but it was the final line of the letter that made Daniel's knees go weak. "We wanted to honor your kindness in the only way we knew how. Please accept this small token of our gratitude." Daniel's hands shook as he unfolded the accompanying documents and realized what they were. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a deed to a small but fully paid-for house in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city, accompanied by a heartfelt note from the family explaining how they had pooled together every resource, worked tirelessly, and even received help from relatives to make this gift possible. Stunned, Daniel sank to the floor, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a tidal wave. All the pain, the doubt, and the endless nights of questioning suddenly seemed to vanish, replaced by a profound sense of purpose and validation. His act of selflessness, once a source of so much hardship, had come full circle in a way he never could have imagined. This was more than a house, it was a symbol of the lives he had touched, of the ripple effect his kindness had set into motion. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. It was a turning point, a moment of clarity that reminded him of the power of compassion and the potential for even the smallest acts of kindness to create extraordinary change. As he sat there, clutching the letter to his chest, Daniel knew his life was about to take a new direction, one filled with possibilities he hadn't dared to dream of before. Daniel stood in the doorway of his new home, his trembling hands clutching the keys that symbolized a future he never thought possible. The quiet neighborhood stretched out before him, its tree-lined streets and warm porch lights a stark contrast to the cold, empty world he had grown accustomed to. As he stepped inside, the scent of fresh paint and polished wood filled the air, and tears blurred his vision as he took in the sight of the modest but beautifully furnished living room. On the small table by the window sat a framed photograph, left intentionally for him, showing the family he had helped years ago. The man, woman, and child stood together, their smiles radiant, their eyes full of gratitude and hope. Next to the photograph was a handwritten letter, and as Daniel sank into the nearest chair, he unfolded the paper with unsteady hands. The words on the page seemed to leap out at him, each one carrying the weight of the family's journey and the profound impact of his selflessness. They wrote of the night he had stopped on the highway, a stranger who had offered them not just a car but a chance to reclaim their lives. They described how that moment had given them the strength to move forward, to build something new, and to believe in the kindness of the world even when it felt like everything was falling apart. The child, now older, had drawn a picture that was included with the letter, a vibrant, crayon-colored depiction of their family in Daniel's old car, with a message scrawled in bold, uneven letters: "Thank you for saving us." As Daniel's tears fell freely, the memories of his struggles flooded back, intertwining with the overwhelming emotions of this moment. He thought of the nights he had spent walking home in the cold, the hours of doubt and despair that had threatened to consume him, and the endless questioning of whether his sacrifice had meant anything. But here, in this quiet room, surrounded by tangible proof of the lives he had touched, all those doubts seemed to dissolve. He clutched the letter to his chest, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose and fulfillment he had never known. In the stillness, a knock echoed through the house, pulling him from his thoughts. Wiping his face, Daniel opened the door to find the very family he had helped standing before him, their faces illuminated by the glow of the porch light. The man, his voice thick with emotion, said, "We couldn't just send the house. We wanted to thank you in person." The woman stepped forward, her eyes glistening, and placed her hands over Daniel's. "You gave us everything when we had nothing," she said softly. "We wouldn't be here without you." The child, now a young boy, held out a small, carefully wrapped box. Daniel knelt to accept it, his hands shaking as he untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside was a miniature replica of his old car, handcrafted with incredible detail, and beneath it was a note that read, "This was never about the car. It was about you showing us that there's always hope." The boy looked up at Daniel, his eyes wide with admiration, and said, "You're our hero." In that moment, the weight of every hardship Daniel had endured was replaced by an overwhelming sense of joy and connection. He embraced the family, his tears mingling with theirs, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. This was his emotional climax, the peak of a journey defined by sacrifice, resilience, and the extraordinary power of kindness. As they sat together in the living room, sharing stories and laughter, Daniel realized that his life had been forever changed, not just by what he had given, but by what he had received in return. As the sun set behind the modest house that Daniel now called home, a warm golden light bathed the living room where he sat surrounded by the family whose lives he had unknowingly changed forever. The house, once just a distant dream for Daniel, had become a sanctuary, not just for him but for the connections and new beginnings it symbolized. The family, Mark, Sarah, and their son, Lucas, had visited often since that emotional reunion, forging a bond with Daniel that felt more like family than friendship. Mark had found stable work, thanks to the car Daniel had given them, which allowed him to commute to his brother's business, a turning point that had lifted them out of the cycle of despair. Sarah had started a small home-based baking business, using the security of their new situation to turn her passion into an income, and Lucas, now thriving in school, often drew pictures that he brought to Daniel's house, each one more vibrant than the last. The house had become a hub of life and love, filled with laughter, shared meals, and the echoes of a past that had transformed into a hopeful future. For Daniel, the changes were even more profound. The self-doubt and loneliness that had once consumed him had been replaced by a quiet confidence and a renewed sense of purpose. The hardships he had endured no longer felt like burdens but stepping stones that had led him to this moment. His relationship with his neighbors, once strained by his struggles, had deepened as they saw the man who had once been on the edge of despair rise with dignity and gratitude. Mrs. Cooper, the elderly widow, now visited him regularly, often bringing homemade cookies and staying for long chats by the window where they watched the world go by. Jamal, the boy next door, had returned with his math problems, but their time together had evolved into something more, with Daniel mentoring him not only in academics but in life. Even Claire, his co-worker from the diner, had taken notice of the change in him. Her once puzzled looks at his generosity had turned into admiration, and their shared laughter during breaks now carried an unspoken understanding of resilience and kindness. The gift of the house was only the beginning. Daniel, inspired by the family's journey and their determination to pay forward his kindness, began volunteering at a local shelter, sharing his story with others who were struggling. He became a source of hope for those who felt forgotten, his words carrying the weight of experience and the light of possibility. He met people from all walks of life, each with their own battles, and found joy in offering them the same compassion that had once lifted him. His life, once defined by loss and hardship, had transformed into a testament to the power of human connection and the enduring ripple effects of a single act of kindness. As the seasons changed, so did Daniel's perspective on the world. The car he had given away, once his only lifeline, had become a symbol of his resilience and the profound impact one person could have on another. The family's unexpected gift had not only given him a home but a renewed sense of belonging and purpose. On quiet evenings, he often sat on the porch with Mark and Sarah, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the neighborhood, and he realized that his life had come full circle. The struggles he had faced were no longer weights on his shoulders but memories that shaped his strength and empathy. Lucas, the young boy who had once waved shyly from the back seat of the car, now called Daniel Uncle Dan, his drawings filling the walls of the house with color and joy. One day, as they sat together on the living room floor surrounded by crayons and papers, Lucas looked up at Daniel with wide eyes and said, "You're my hero." The words, simple yet profound, struck Daniel in a way he hadn't expected, bringing tears to his eyes as he hugged the boy tightly. In that moment, Daniel understood the true depth of what he had gained, not just a house or a sense of stability but a family, a purpose, and a legacy of kindness that would continue to grow long after him. As the stars appeared in the sky above his new home, Daniel felt a peace he hadn't known in years. His journey had been far from easy, marked by sacrifices and doubts that had often seemed insurmountable, but it had led him to a place of love, connection, and hope. The family's gift had transformed his life, but it was the relationships he had built, the lives he had touched, and the lessons he had learned along the way that truly defined his new beginning. And as he sat on the porch that night, listening to the laughter of his newfound family echoing through the house, Daniel smiled, knowing that his story was far from over, it was just the beginning of a life filled with endless possibilities, born from the simple yet profound act of offering his car to a family in need. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on how small acts of kindness can ripple through the lives of others in ways you can't imagine. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder of the power of compassion and generosity. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring tale like this. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that remind us of the humanity in all of us. What would you have done in Daniel's place? Let us know in the comments below.